I will confess at the start, you have two of us that have a little divided loyalty right now because in about 5 minutes, the Saban gold medal ceremony is about to start for people that are near and dear to Barney and I. So we're going to be sort of monitoring this. We'll keep it off, but obviously attend to this as well.
Well, why don't we just go down? Why don't we go down the line? And so I would ask each of you to have one or two sort of what you would consider key action items from your perspective, taking into account what we've heard before, as well as what you've been doing all along. And they may be the same, similar, or very different from each other. But why don't we'll go around the room and virtually, and let's see if we can catalog some things. So, Q, you're first.
So if I had to target one or two action items, one of them would be when talking about diversity of R&D or manufacturing, I think that there really has to be very much targeted efforts to reach out to those institutions or individuals, because I think some of what may happen is that there's an expectation of familiarity among high-income countries in terms of where funding is or where some of those collaborations are. There has to be a certain level of targeted outreach to make sure that we don't miss some of those areas and institutions that maybe we normally don't work with. So I think targeted outreach globally will be an action item and important as we go forward.
Okay, Bill?
Yeah, I think one thing that was touched on and was critically important when we were working on the COVID-19 program that I don't have an easy solution for, whether you're talking about CP 100 days or our own CEO, Albert Bourla, advertised that we would have a vaccine in 100 days. We didn't quite make that, but it was very fast. But it was driven in part not just by the clinical work that was done, but by the nature of making manufacturing decisions at risk. And I'm talking about big dollar sorts of decisions. I mean, historically, even working for things that have major markets that are appealing to big pharma, it's challenging, even in that circumstance, to get funding for manufacturing at scale until you get to proof of concept. And of course, actually we advocate a lot of the time in the research group to make the decision sooner. Otherwise, you have a gap. You can't get clinical trial material in time. You can't essentially be prepared to launch if you wait that late. So, with the 100-day, CP approach, I think one of the challenges has to be to figure out how you're going to contend with the manufacturing piece and get some momentum to make those decisions earlier. And that's tough because, in the case of COVID-19, Albert Bourla, to his credit, made the decision to fund with, as I said, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars before we had any data at all, other than maybe preclinical data, and thinking, okay, we had some possibility of being successful. So to me, an action item has to be to how you're going to solve whether, and again, this then dovetails with, in terms of, are you setting things up in country where you've got to staff them, you've got to staff to have the expertise to be able to meet the quality requirements, you've got a staff to get the necessary regulatory expertise or work through WHO. So that I see as a challenge, and an action would be to solve for that.
Okay, thanks. Mike.
Well, I just pick up on a couple of themes. Well, first, the division of global and domestic is not something we normally do because Glenda Gray is one of my biggest partners. So, this is to us one homogeneous effort when we're trying to work together. Second, I think the constitutive funding is really important, like that Barney raised. We go from 0 to 60 to 0, literally just like that, right? We go massive amounts of money and then there's nothing. And that's just isn't favorable to the species, and I mean it does not make any sense for our species, and we don't learn any lessons. And then the third thing is the idea that I think Dr. Shah brought up about validation. It's a complicated concept of how you validate investigators who are working on a problem, on the Pfizer vaccine or the monoclonal antibodies. In my own mind, though, I think the investigators need to participate themselves in transparency with the communities. It can't always have a middleman. There has to be a much more direct relationship, which we do, by the way. Every network has a community advisory board, many community advisory boards, and we meet with them all the time to get buy-in to the trials we're doing. And then those trials actually don't seem to have the same disaster that's occurred in the COVID space. So there's a lesson that we learned from our other trials that is totally different than COVID. So those are my 3 points. I'll stop.
Okay, thanks. Barney.
Well, I don't think pandemic preparedness was part of the recent G20 meetings, which is one obvious flaw. And we don't have a 194 country accord on agreeing how we're going to manage and coordinate pandemic preparedness, which is maybe part of climate change, but it's its own thing. And it should at least be part of the climate change accord. And because what we need at least a dozen big sequencing facilities around the globe in biologically diverse areas. We need at least one big multidisciplinary vaccine development program on each continent, and we need to be able to convince people that it's in the best interest of high-income countries to help low-income countries solve regional problems before they become global problems. It's not like you're not wasting your money when you solve regional problems. HIV was a regional Central African problem before it became a global pandemic. And so all these things began regionally. And it needs to be a global priority to help get these things solved before they go around the globe.
Okay, thanks. Omer?
Yeah, I would say, as I said earlier, investment. And the investment, absolutely, we need to make sure that we are investing in the research and the science and doing everything we have to do to be able to bring products to market. But we have to equally invest in the systems that are going to then convince people of the trust and the implementation. So it's not just about vaccines, but it's about vaccinations. And that end user, that end community member is so key to this. And not having that incorporation into the process is a real issue. And we've got to do a markedly better job of that engagement. And then the other piece is to make sure that we're also investing in public health and true public health systems across both the domestic world, but I agree with Mike here about this is an artificial separation of domestic and global. We need to be investing across the system globally as well. Thanks.
Okay, our virtual people, Peter.
I'm sorry, you wanted some additional comments?
Some one or two action items. I'm sure you have 20 of them, but some key ones, just that are reflective of the discussion that we've had thus far today.
I think what I've asked with regards to combating anti-vaccine activism is an intergovernment agency task force, because the health sector clearly is fumbling at this, and we need smart people from outside the health sector to help us with this. We need people from the Justice Department, the Commerce Department. We need people from the State Department, because you've got foreign actors like Russia flooding us with bots and trolls. And so creating that so recognizing that vaccine hesitancy is as much a cause of inequality as any other force, and bringing together that interagency task force for that purpose, I think is going to be absolutely critical. It's also would be helpful to do it at the UN, at the level of the UN agencies, and bring together not just WHO, but all of the UN agencies on this issue.
Okay, thanks. Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Kent. This has become, it's not unusual, a very vaccine-oriented discussion, but of course, I'm working for FINE. I'll come back to the diagnostics and the surveillance part, because we wouldn't know which vaccines we need to make for pandemic preparedness or for response unless we have the right surveillance systems and diagnostics. And I'll take a little bit of a different approach to that than is often said. I think that the key to that is actually not I'm not opposed to genomic surveillance, but I think the real key is what happens at the primary care level. If you look what the signals are for outbreaks, it's still really more a bunch of clinicians who recognize that something's happening, or the routine surveillance systems that pick up episignals. So that's extremely important. But extremely important that the tools that we put in, and we do have the potential for new tools with RDTs and multiplex diagnostics at a reasonable price. Those tools need to be put in a way that they also shore up the response for endemic diseases, because otherwise they're never sustainable. And so they need to be something that the patient, the provider, the healthcare provider, the government, the Ministry of Health sees value in, and an everyday. So you pick up the malaria, but also have the capacity to pick up the Ebola, if you will. And so I think that would be really, although it's not as a shiny new toy, it's probably, for me, the possibility of a game changer.
Okay, thanks. Glenda?
I think global collaboration is important for the research that we need to do. And so I would continue to emphasize the need for global collaboration of all scientists and open and sharing access, sharing your data. We also need, besides globalization, we need localization of R&D. And I support the initiatives to make sure that regions can respond for vaccine development and both diagnostics, and that's important. So that's my second point. And my third point is just, again, the importance of social science to understand this, the conspiracy theories, the vaccine hesitancy, anti-vaccine, and also the lack of trust in Western medicine, and to address all of these issues to make sure that we can respond in an appropriate way when we do have vaccines or therapeutics that can help with a pandemic.
Okay, thanks. And James?
Thanks. So quite a wish list we're coming, but Christmas is coming. So I will add. So firstly, on Dan's point, definitely, as I said, surveillance is so important. That feels like something we should and can build in between before the next one comes, let's say. But critical to it, as I said, is that the output is shared. So any pathogens and their digital sequence are shared immediately, publicly, to all researchers, public researchers, private researchers, without bureaucracy attached to them, so that the research can start. That's number one. Number two, and some of these things are happening, right? So number two would be a bit more clarity on a global consensus as far as we can on what are the viral risks that we're really looking at. There are a number of lists, and the WHO is doing a process to come up with that, and I know CEPI is also looking at it, and others. But that then needs to be used carefully to try and make sure that then work is being done against each of them, right? In a very simple way. And I'm not talking about a command and control sort of mechanism here, because that I don't think will work. What we want to encourage are multiple research groups, but make sure that there aren't any gaps or any major gaps. And then finally, as I again mentioned up front, the regulatory system, whilst it did step up amazingly well during COVID in many ways, but it's still very clear that there was a lot of innovation that regulators needed to do on the hoof. And now we should make sure that it's what they've learned and what they've experienced and how to do those accelerated emergency approvals, and what didn't work, which was the lack of reliance. In fact, there were, I'm sure companies will talk in more specifics, but companies that developed a vaccine or therapeutics still had to file and register it in different ways in many different countries around the world before access was available, by and large. That, in this day and age, that doesn't seem to be useful. And I know work has been going on for many years to improve that. But let's be honest, we can accelerate that now, and we should. We should take the initiative, take the crisis, in fact, that has happened in order to drive a change. a step change.
Great, thanks. And it looks like Walter is off.